From the same source I have not taken, my sorrow I could not awaken, my heart to joy at the same tone, and all I loved alone.
My name is Ed Poe. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. My name is Edgar Allan Poe.
My name is Enrica Jang. I'm the executive director at Poe Baltimore. We're the nonprofit that manages and interprets the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum in Baltimore.
So, can you tell me, briefly, your journey from when you found out, in your young life, who he was, and then how you got you to work here? Because you're clearly really passionate about Poe.
I love Poe. I think I'm like a lot of American kids. I got Poe in high school.
Yeah.
So required reading for good reason.
Mm-hmm.
But also, like a lot of teenagers, I think the horror and the darkness really appealed to my imagination, and it was I was a reader very early, but something about what you perceive as a kid as these older authors, and it's supposed to be stuffy, but then these authors are writing about this really cool, dark, fun stuff. So I think the horror really appealed to me. I was just one of those just a dark kid.
Same.
But then as I go back to Poe over my life, I find new things in Poe. Mm-hmm. You see the sadness, and you start to see the nuance. You start to appreciate all of this depth of emotion in Poe, and so that experience, just returning again and again to these beloved works, it's not just the darkness. There's just a lot of richness and depth.
I first read Poe, I remember in Mr. McKelvey's 6th grade English class, and it was The Telltale Heart. And Mr. McKelvey would tell stories of, he wrote his own stories about different things, but then he presented The Telltale Heart and how there was, a heart in the floor and all that kind of stuff. And just as a 6th grader, it was mesmerizing.
That's what we read in your class first.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, and The Raven.
Did they tell you, through the school district, what Poe to teach, or were they just
how did that work?
Or did you
actually back then? I think at that point we kind of got to pick and choose, but we were doing a project with MPT, mm-hmm. And it's still there. Actually, we were helping with a website, and it's an interactive website of his works and his life, and
I think I remember going to
it. Well, and we were modeling it for them. They had created it, and we were like their test rats, I guess. And
yeah, I remember we'd go through, and it was because a lot of it too was the mystery of how he died was played into that website.
Yeah, there's you are a first person going through the library, mm-hmm. and you start to research it, and you start to find these different things.
I forgot all about that.
I
thought that was the coolest thing.
Do you remember the first work of Poe that you ever read?
Yeah, it was The Pit and the Pendulum.
Well, how old were you?
God, probably 15. It actually got me really into his
mm-hmm.
Into the way he was telling his story, the
mm-hmm.
way he literally manipulated language.
Do you remember the first work by Poe you ever read?
I feel like it was definitely The Raven.
Mm-hmm.
English class, you do The Raven at least once a year.
How did you first discover Poe, and do you remember the first work of his you ever read?
I'm pretty sure that I was introduced to Poe through all of the various versions of The Raven. I distinctly remember The Simpsons. The one I remember reading first was probably the Cask of Amontillado.
I first encountered the works of Edgar Allan Poe in school. I remember reading The Telltale Heart, The Raven, and a few other works in my middle school English class, and I was immediately enamored.
First Edgar Allan Poe work I've ever read was The Telltale Heart. I want to say that was in 8th grade, and I just remember reading it and being like, oh my god, this was so good.
Poe wrote some of the darkest stories ever told into existence, and many of them have been retold many times in a plethora of ways. The 60s saw many movies, usually starring Vincent Price, some silly, some spooky, all aiming to retell many of Poe's tales. There, of course, has been tons of literature aiming to retell elements of his tales. There's even a movie called The Raven that is somewhat based on elements of his life. But while most retellings and adaptations aim to tell Poe's stories in a serious light, there is a small group of creators based out of Los Angeles, California called Shipwrecked Comedy, and they aim to tell the tales of Poe and his life as just that, a comedy.
What is that rapping at my chamber door?
Good afternoon, sir. Can I interest you in some Girl Scout cookies?
What made you guys decide you wanted to write about Poe and to do it from a comedy standpoint when arguably everything else about Poe has been done from a drama standpoint?
I mean, I feel like it's just my vibe in general is making spooky things funny. Like, I've always liked to do that. And it just started as the Girl Scout cookie sketch. That was like the first thing I did, and I wrote it a long time ago before Shipwrecked was even a thing. And I was just like, it should be really funny if this sad poet had to encounter someone who's what's the opposite of him.
This guy comes up to me and he's like, so I'm having a dinner party. Cool.
What is that rapping at my chamber door?
Okay, first, not a rapping. That's a doorbell. Secondly, you invited these people here.
You guys reference, like, the dinner party in Telltale Vlog. Is that meant to be what becomes Poe Party when Lenore mentions that Poe wants to have a dinner party?
Yeah, that's what the idea came from. I remember writing that, because a lot of it was improv, but I did write down the stuff about the dinner party, and I remember I was at NBC Page, and I was, like, waiting for the Tonight Show to start, and I, like, had my notebook, and I was, like, writing out an idea, and I was like, who could all be at this dinner party? And I was just, like, listing all these authors.
Do you guys each have, like, a favorite moment from Poe Party that was, like, a joke that was, like, a literary nerd joke? Like, people would have to have read Poe to find it funny.
We're just talking about this, but The Old Man and the Boat, which, again, is
that one.
not a Poe thing, but is so funny.
A ghost on a murderous rampage. Are you guys listening to yourselves? Because you sound cray.
Oh, sounds like an Edgar Allan Poe story. Perhaps you and the Raven fetishist were in on it together.
I don't need to act things out in order to write them. I have what we like to call an imagination. You ever heard of that? Oh, no. Please tell us more about the old man and the boat.
Now that you guys have done all this Poe work, do you guys have favorite works of Poe, like poems or stories?
I mean, I'm partial to Inbell.
Yeah.
I would say mine is, of what I've read, is Cask of Amontillado. It's pretty nice.
I've read it since, and I'm just like, all right. I mean, I guess Fortunato was very drunk, so he didn't know what was going on.
We have enjoyed a lovely evening sampling various milks and cookies.
Did you wall them into the cellar?
Yes, I did.
So while Shipwrecked Comedy's version of Poe's life is hilarious and heartwarming, it's not historically accurate. So you may be asking yourself, if Edgar Allan Poe wasn't hosting murderous dinner parties in his mansion with his ghostly roommate, then what was his life like? Edgar Allan Poe was born January 19, 1809 to impoverished actors Elizabeth Arnold Poe and David Poe Jr. It wasn't long after Poe's birth that his father left and his mother died. Poe and his two siblings were then split up and adopted by 3 different families. So at 2 years old, Poe had already suffered the loss of his father, mother, and both his brother and sister. Poe was adopted by John and Frances Allen, and while Frances was very kind to Poe, it did not take long at all for John Allen to show obvious dislike for him. For as long as John Allen lived, he was incredibly emotionally abusive towards his adoptive son. son. Poe's youth involved him switching schools often and being a disappointment to John Allan quite frequently. Poe never knew quite why his adoptive father didn't like him, but in 1820, when Poe began to write poetry, John Allan made it known that he thought such an endeavor was pointless and embarrassing. John Allan having a negative impact on Poe's life would only grow as time continued. In Poe's young adult life, he began a romantic relationship with his childhood friend Elmira Royster, and it didn't take long for the two to become engaged. But shortly after their engagement, Poe had to leave for school, this time to the University of Virginia to study ancient languages. Poe wrote to Elmira often and received no response back. Upon returning home a few years later, he learned that Elmira was married to someone else. It was suspected that both young people's parents had interfered, with Poe's own father speaking out against him and encouraging Elmira to marry somebody else. Poe returned to school heartbroken and became addicted to gambling, and it didn't take long for him to start racking up serious debts. He wrote to Allan often begging for help, and usually not even for money, but for John Allan to send him things like clothes and soap. But despite how basic or simple his requests, John Allan refused to help Poe at all, making it clear he was an embarrassment to him. After a while, Poe was kicked out of school, and when he returned home to Richmond, Virginia, John Allan made it clear he was not welcome, forcing Poe to spend several nights wandering the streets, impoverished and close to starvation. Poe wrote to John Allan often, explaining his starvation and poverty to him, but John Allan never wrote back, leaving Poe with nowhere else to go. So as a last resort, he joined the army. In 1828, Poe reconciled with John Allan, but this good fortune was soon overshadowed when his adoptive mother, Frances Allan, died. Now, at just 19 years old, Poe had already, in one way or another, lost 3 women who were very important to him. Later in his life, Poe would go on to address this topic in an essay of his where he wrote the line, "The death of a beautiful woman is undoubtedly one of the most poetical topics in the world," a line that would go on to cause discourse among poets and writers for many years to come. Many view it as a sexist comment. The death of a beautiful woman is undoubtedly the most poetical topic in the world. Some have taken this over the years as a somewhat sexist comment. Some see it as him trying to make sense out of all the women he lost in his life. Where do you fall in this debate?
Well, I actually spent some time with this question because at first my immediate response was like, that is sexist.
Yeah.
But then I got thinking about it.
It sounds really bad out of context.
It sounds awful out of context. But then I got thinking about it. I'm like, you know, he lost a lot of women in his life. Women were a big influence in his life, I think.
Well, because the only, men in his life was his foster father who openly hated him.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think he really had a soft spot, so to speak, for women. And, I don't think he meant it to be sexist.
I think with any quote, you want to look at the context. Where was it said? So I did a little bit of research, and it was actually in an essay that he wrote. And the essay was called The Philosophy of Composition. And in it, he's giving a step-by-step process, a formula of how to write effective, popular stories. And in it, he writes about how for a story you want to choose an impression or an effect that you want to have on the reader. And his choice for the Raven was beauty. And it's throughout the Raven, the wording, just the mood of it is beautiful. And he says beauty, he defines beauty in it as an intense elevation of the soul. I think if his quote was something about the physical beauty of women, then I could see it as a sexist comment of him just romanticizing women in their, ethereal otherness and how they're beautiful when they die. But in this sense, I really think he's talking about something much more than physical beauty, so I don't see it as sexist. I see it as something important to his writing.
Poe did have some good fortune come his way in 1829 when he self-published a book of poetry called Al-Araf, Tamerlane, and Other Minor Poems. And while the book was not the huge success that Poe dreamed it would be, it was well received by everyone who read it. After this small triumph, the first of many to come in Poe's life, he was accepted at Military Academy at West Point. However, it did not take Poe long to realize that military life made him miserable. So he worked very hard to get himself kicked out, and he succeeded. He then moved to Baltimore to live with his aunt and uncle and his long-lost brother, Henry Poe. However, Henry had already succumbed to alcoholism at this point in his life, and shortly after him and Poe were reunited, he died later that year. Poe would later go on to write about his brother's alcoholism in 1838 with his first and only full-length novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, a book which Poe later denounced in his life for its problematic subject matter. We began to remember what had passed rather as a frightful dream from which we had been happily awakened, than as events which had taken place in sober and naked reality. After his brother's death, Poe's literary career began to advance. By 1832, his short stories were appearing in various literary magazines to a fair amount of critical acclaim. But he still wasn't making much money, and he was struggling day to day to even get by. Then, in late 1834, John Allan died, leaving behind an immense inheritance. But he left none of that inheritance to Poe, his son. At this point, Poe was living with his aunt, Maria Clem, and his cousin, Virginia Clem. And though he was much older than Virginia, 26 to her 13, the two fell in love. And when Poe made it clear to his aunt that he would like to marry Virginia, his aunt made it known that she did not approve of the match. Now let's be clear, this was the 19th century. No one really had any qualms with cousins marrying each other, and even an age difference as big as 13 years wasn't seen as that big of a deal, as long as the man was rich. And despite his growing fame in the literary world, Poe was still very much living in poverty, and his finances were now even worse thanks to getting let go from the Southern Literary Messenger for reportedly showing up to work drunk. There have been many debates over the years as to whether or not Poe was an alcoholic. Some people believed that he was just a lightweight and it only took a few drinks to put him over the edge, while more seemed to believe he was drinking to excess to quiet the demons in his own head. Regardless of what the cause was for Poe to show up to work drunk one day, costing him his job, it was this action that led his aunt Maria Clem to make it known that she believed her daughter deserved better than a destitute poet. In 1835, Maria Clem moved away with Virginia and wrote to Poe saying that she planned to give Virginia away in custody to somebody else. Poe wrote back a very passionate letter, a letter that was full of suicidal language. I am blinded with tears while writing this letter. I have no wish to live another hour. You know how little I am able to bear up under the pressure of grief. My bitterest enemy would pity me could he now read my heart. I have no desire to live, and will not. My agony is more than I can bear, that you have driven me to the grave, for a love like mine can never be gotten over. Write immediately. I shall be all anxiety and dread until I hear from you. Now, I am obviously not a certified mental health professional. I cannot with 100% certainty diagnose anyone with a mental illness, and none of us can truly diagnose the dead. But I do think it is safe to see that in this letter, Poe was making a cry for help that went unanswered. Despite his trials in courting Virginia Clem, Poe's wishes of marrying her finally came true on September 22, 1836, when the two traveled to Baltimore to elope. A year after that, he was reinstated at the Southern Literary Messenger, and 2 years after that, The Fall of the House of Usher was published. It would go on to become one of the most famous horror stories of all time.
He entered into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. The most insipid food was alone endurable. The odors of all flowers proved oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light. And there were but peculiar sounds which inspired him with horror.
According According to Mental Health America, symptoms of schizophrenia can include delusions, hallucinations, disordered behavior, disorganized thinking, social withdrawal, and a complete lack of apathy.
Poe definitely suffered.
When you look at the history of mental health,
let's get into this. Let's get into the mental health.
Not treated very well.
Obviously suffered a lot, and I feel like if he didn't, then his writing wouldn't be as fantastic as it is, because he writes in a way that's very, like, unique, and it's like he's basically taking what he's feeling and personifying them into characters, and the characters are like representations of like the different like things that he's feeling on the inside.
Not only do many of these elements appear in works of Poe like The Fall of the House of Usher and many others we've yet to discuss, but they seem to show up in Poe himself. Many people who knew him in real life complained about his behavior, saying that he was withdrawn, odd, raving, delusional. The list goes on and on. Which brings me back to what I mentioned earlier regarding Poe's drinking. In a time when the only mental health care in America was to call someone mad and lock them up in an insane asylum, what were those suffering from mental illness supposed to do? What was Poe himself supposed to do if he was in fact suffering from schizophrenia? Well, in a time when there was no medication for the mentally ill, many used drinking as a tool to quiet the demons in their own heads. So, if Poe was in fact hearing and seeing things that weren't actually there, and being ignored by his loved ones as he reached out and begged for help during his suicidal spirals, maybe Poe turned to alcoholism because he saw it as the only way he'd be able to get through the day. However, despite Poe's deteriorating mental state, his literary success only continued to grow and grow. In 1842, he published the story The Mask of the Red Death, a tale about rich aristocrats who lock themselves away in a castle to have a party while the rest of the outside world dies from a plague. Their festivities, however, are interrupted when the physical manifestation of death arrives to make them pay for their sins. This story was heralded at the time and to this day as one of Poe's most wonderfully terrifying tales.
If you look at all of his works, he had like a checklist. Like, yep, there's a simile, and there's metaphor, and there's some internal rhyme and external rhyme.
Because Poe was one of the first, certainly the first American author to really write in the persona of a madman, in the persona, this first person point of view of the villain.
Scholar Michael L. Burdock writes in his book Grim Phantasms that what makes Poe's formula for fear so brilliant is his ability to make the reader feel as though they've fallen into a nightmare. Burdock says Poe utilized phobic pressure points to write stories that were universal, and yet when you read them, were disturbingly personal.
Burdock says the steps that must be achieved in Poe's formula are as follows: the isolation of the reader, the stunning of the reader's sensibility, the victimization of the reader's emotions, and the premature burial of the reader's reason.
In conclusion, when Poe wrote his stories, his objective was clear: make the reader feel as if they're going mad. And if the theory I and many others hold about Poe is to be believed, that he was not mentally well, then perhaps Poe also aimed to convey in his stories the horrors of what it was like to live with an undiagnosed and untreated mental illness.
So I think that he was trying to sort of make that maybe not normalize it, but make it this, you're not the only one.
Is there something you think about his stories that makes them like the perfect scary stories and they keep being scary?
Definitely his there's two things I think most with that is first his punctuation. His stories, he used punctuation because I think a lot of his stories and poems he wanted to be read aloud, and he was telling you exactly how to read it.
Yeah.
To pause here. His word choice.
Yeah.
Definitely his word choice and everything that he wrote. His word choice added a lot of meaning, a lot of to his poems and stories.
Unreliable and unstable narrators reached a crescendo in Poe's work in 1843 with the publication of his most famous short story, The Telltale Heart. You all know how this one goes. A narrator who is trying to convince us, the reader, that he's not crazy. He just simply cannot stand the way this old man's eye looks at him. So he kills the man and disposes of the body and buries his heart beneath the floorboards. But soon enough, cops come calling, claiming that neighbors complained about a loud noise. The narrator brings them in to show them the empty room and prove his innocence. But no sooner do the cops enter than the narrator begins to hear the incessant beating of the dead man's heart. The story ends with the famous last sentence, "I admit the deed, pull up the planks, here is the beating of his hideous heart."
So The Telltale Heart is one of his most famous, obviously, and I don't say that just because it's one of my favorites.
Okay, can we just talk about like how creepy this place is? I'm pretty sure there are like hearts in the floorboards.
It's not like the typical way to tell a story because your narrator is like in the future and it's like, okay, so here's how I got here.
The Telltale Heart is one of the most horrifying and enduring works out of Poe's entire body of work.
In 1845, Poe went on to write a poem that would define his legacy, a poem that is considered one of the greatest poems in American literature, The Raven.
For the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. God, you're good.
I'm standing here outside the Deer Park Tavern in Newark, Delaware, built in 1851 on the ground where the original St. Patrick's Inn, built in 1757, once stood. And it believed that here Edgar Allan Poe stayed on December 23rd, 1843, and began to pen his literary magnum opus, The Raven. I cannot be confirmed 100% that Poe wrote parts of his piece, The Raven, here, if admittedly he wrote any of it here at all. It has been reported by various Poe historians that he spent over a decade perfecting the poem, which means he would have begun writing it during the time around his marriage to Virginia Clem, which seems like a very strange time to begin writing such a grim piece of poetry. If it took him a decade to get it right, then obviously he couldn't have written all of it in the same place. Some Poe historians claim he wrote most of it at a tavern in Saratoga Springs, while others claim he wrote most of the final draft, if not all of it, while staying in a boarding house on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And of course, many die-hard Poe enthusiasts claim that he wrote most of the masterpiece here at the Deer Park Tavern, or what was once the St. Patrick's Inn. Now, whether or not any of that is true, it makes for a good story. And speaking of good stories, let's talk about what The Raven is actually about. What is it about this poem about a talking bird that only knows one word that has made it the most iconic thing he ever wrote?
Many of Poe's poems make use of frequent repetition to create memorable lines, but none are quite so memorable as, quoth the Raven, nevermore.
Why do you think, personally, The Raven is, out of everything he made, the most enduring thing he made?
I think it's because everybody's been at that point, whether they want to admit it or not.
Can you explain the point that The Raven's getting across?
I think the point that The Raven's getting across is that nevermore, that there's... It's almost as if The Raven's saying there is no point. You know?
Like this loneliness is all there is.
Loneliness is all there is.
The Raven tells the story of a narrator that we can assume is Poe himself. How he was sleeping on a dreary night when he hears an incessant knocking on his chamber door, and upon opening it, an ominous raven flies in. Poe asks the Raven many questions, including if he'll ever again see his lost Lenore, referencing back to a character from a poem he wrote in 1843 called Lenore, about a young bride who dies on her wedding day.
The fair and debonair, that now so lowly lies, the life still there upon her hair, the death upon her eyes.
Was it always an active choice that Lenore would not talk the way, like, that she talks colloquially, like how we talk now? Was that always a choice, that she wouldn't talk the same as everyone else?
So, I died. I was having like a huge crisis. Who/what should I be haunting? So my BFF Annabelle Lee set me up with this guy. And you know how you can kind of tell what your friends think about you by the kind of guys they set you up to haunt? Seriously. What was she thinking? So this guy, he's real weird. He wrote me a poem.
Yeah. I don't remember how it really became like so Valley Girl. Just kind of how I did it the first day, and then it was like,
Quaff, oh quaff, this kind of nepenthe and forget this lost Lenore.
Did you call me?
Quoth the Raven nevermore.
Many think Lenore was the fictionalized version of Poe's long-lost childhood love, Elmira, while others just see her as the personification of innocence. But regardless of what or who Lenore may be, the Raven only responds to Poe's queries about her, as well as his questions about everything else, with one word: nevermore. This sends Poe into a frustration as he shouts at the Raven, begging the Raven to give him answers about what lies beyond this life, beyond the grave. And the Raven continues to only answer with the word nevermore, a word that means at no time, with no future, not ever. So if we were to go off the popular assumption that this poem is being narrated by Poe himself, then it tragically reads somewhat like a suicide note. Think about it. Poe is begging a raven, a symbol that is frequently used in literature to represent prophecies and omens of death. And he is begging this creature of death about whether or not there is anything to live for, anything to love, anyone who loves him. And the bird keeps responding, no, no, there's not. There is nothing. Poe had already lost so much at this point in his life. His biological parents, his adoptive mother, his brother, his sister, his childhood love. His adoptive father never cared for him and tried to hurt him even in death, struggled through poverty and starvation, and he did all of this while most likely struggling through an untreated mental illness. So it makes sense that the piece of Poe's work that would go on to define his legacy, his life, his body of work, would be one about him spiraling into suicidal thoughts, about him asking a creature of death if there is anything left to live for, and the bird responding, no, no there is not.
It makes you wonder, did no one close to him notice the dark subject matter of the poem? Did no one in his life, his wife or his friends, think to ask, is he okay? Did anyone try to help him?
In 1846, Poe penned another tale that would go on to become a fan favorite, The Cask of Amontillado. This story features the narrator telling us that someone they know needs to be punished severely. But for what offense, we don't know. The narrator tricks their victim into following them down into their cellar by telling them they have a fine wine for them to try down there, a cask of Amontillado. The victim, having already had several drinks that evening, is too drunk to realize that the narrator is chaining them up in a corner of the cellar and doesn't fully come to their senses until it's too late and the narrator is almost done walling them into the cellar. The story concludes with the narrator walking away as the victim drunkenly cries out, "Amontillado!" And the victim never escapes.
How did you react the first time you read this story, and do you have any guess, I mean, how could we ever, as to what led Poe to write it?
Sure. So I do remember reading this in high school, and I reread it again recently. And this is my favorite work by Poe, just because there is such a mystery around it.
Yeah, like, why the hell did he do that? Like,
exactly. Like,
what the hell?
Everyone's reaction is like, reading it, you're like, why is he making all these side remarks? Like, he's super polite to him. I feel like something bad's gonna happen. And okay, yeah, he buried him in the wall, or he bricked him up in the wall. Like, this this story was meant to give readers a WTF reaction. And I think that's why it's lasted so long, is because everyone's like, he insulted you? Was that really a reason to build a wall up around him and have him starve to death? Was it really?
Yeah, the first time I read it, it really hit a part of me that was very visceral, because I hadn't read anything like that before. I was still fairly young. But it was also a little titillating. I do feel like it hits that deep part of your psyche that tells you to do these terrible things that you're not supposed to do. And, you know, for the vast majority of us, we don't do them. Like that idea of when you're standing on top of a cliff or you're sitting on top of a tall building, your brain is like, what would it be like to jump?
I did read a reason for his writing of it.
Okay.
That I think answers the why, the WTF. So apparently he wrote this story as a response to Thomas Dunn English, and English wrote a parody of Poe as a character in his novel. And Poe read his novel and was like, WTF, dude, that's not who I am. You're painting this, like, basically like Family Guy or The Simpsons, putting a famous person on and making a caricature of them. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's like, really, dude, now you make the public think that I'm this weirdo. So to get back at him, man, being bricked up into the wall, in my eyes, is English. He is insulted by him as the narrator is insulted by English, and there are references in the story to English's novel. In English's novel, it talks a lot about secret societies, and we have the mention of the Mason in this story, and also the image of the snake biting the heel. There's a similar animal and foot image in English's novel, so it's no secret that he was definitely writing this as a response to English's novel. So it's kind of like the first rap battle.
A new wine cellar.
You just sit down there and scream Amontillado, and I can't have friends.
Well, you should try it. It's very
I'm
therapeutic.
embarrassed.
Shortly after the publication of the Cask of Amontillado, Virginia Clem Poe fell ill with tuberculosis, and her chances of survival did not look good. Some of the last remaining letters from Poe's life are ones he penned to Virginia during the year before her death. They spoke of his love for her and his hope and need that she survive, that she live, for he truly was beginning to believe that she was the only thing he had left in this world. You are my greatest and only stimulus now to battle with this uncongenial, unsatisfactory, and ungrateful life. Poe lost more than anyone deserves to lose. He suffered more grief and hardship than anyone deserves to suffer. And despite what 21st century ideals might have to say about their marriage and whether or not it was appropriate for the myriad of reasons I've given, I do truly believe that they loved each other. Whether that love was romantic or platonic, it seems evident to me that they had a strong bond, that they clearly cared about each other, and that Poe clearly needed Virginia in his life. On January 30th, 1847, Virginia Clem Poe died, and Edgar Allan Poe fell into a depression from which he never really emerged. Poe also wrote to a friend in a letter that year after Virginia's death. Each time I felt all the agonies of her death, and at each accession of the disorder I loved her more dearly and clung to her life with more desperate pertinacity. But I am constitutionally sensitive, nervous in a very unusual degree. I became insane, with long intervals of horrible sanity.
On October 3rd, 1849, Dr. Joseph E. Snodgrass received the following note. Dear Sir, there is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's Fourth Ward Polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar Allan Poe, and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you. He is in need of immediate assistance. Yours in haste, Joss W. Walker. Poe was found by a Dr. Snodgrass and a Mrs. St. Leon Loud unconscious on the side of the street in Baltimore. He was taken to Washington College Hospital, where he did not regain consciousness until the following morning. He then, for the next few days, passed in and out of consciousness, raving deliriously while he was awake. He was never able to recount to anyone in the hospital what had happened to put him in such a state.
Early in the morning of October 7th, while laying in his hospital bed, Edgar Allan Poe whispered a quiet prayer. Lord, help my poor soul. That was it. Then Edgar Allan Poe was dead.
He was originally buried in an unmarked grave, and only 4 people attended his funeral. Obviously, since then, proper homage has been paid to his death and his legacy. After his death, several poems were released that had not been published before, the last of them being Annabel Lee, which is considered one of the greatest love poems of all time.
It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. She was a child, and I was a child, in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted, her and me. And this was the reason that, long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud by night, chilling my Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise, but I see the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so, all the night tide, I lay down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in a sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the side of the sea.
Do you like it?
I think that it is the most romantic thing I've ever read.
Annabel Lee is another female figure from post-poetic fiction that, much like Lenore, many people have speculated over the years onto whether or not she was based on a real person, and whether or not that person was Virginia Clemm.
Amidst the publications of some final poems of his in the wake of his death, slanderous obituaries started to be published by his literary enemies, claiming that he would not be missed. And soon, rumors about how he died began to spread and have continued to spread to this day. And since hospitals in the 19th century did not conduct autopsies, there is no way for us to ever truly know for certain what brought an end to the great poet's life. There are many, many theories, but some of them include carbon monoxide poisoning, rabies, mugging, cooping, the flu, brain tumor, and alcohol poisoning.
I think that because Poe's death became so sensational, it really is difficult to truly know what was going on.
My favorite theory of Poe's death is one of the more outlandish. I like to believe that Poe was a victim of a strange form of election fraud called cooping.
For me, the easiest would be just alcohol poisoning.
And I bet it was a combination of things, but by the time he reached his mid-40s and was, still drinking, trying to hide it even, I believe, but still drinking a lot.
He lost a job for showing up drunk.
Right. It had, I'm sure it was some kind of effect of his lifelong drinking problem.
At the time, his wife died from tuberculosis. People were dying young anyway.
Yeah.
But because he had this mysterious death, I think that also created some extra buzz around him.
And the final rumor about how Poe died that most people are reluctant to give any credibility to is that Poe committed suicide.
Poe really did suffer, and he had mental illness, obviously. So whether or not it was, like, actual suicide, like intentional suicide, or maybe he was just going through so much that, it was like he needed to numb the pain through alcohol, and then he ended up not being able to come back from it.
When someone is in a depressed state, and I can speak on this personally, you get to the point where you're on this precipice of suicide, right? And if you stay on that precipice too long,
it's easier.
It gets easier and easier, and you think of it as your only way out. So I think that Poe may have kind of felt that way, but he may not have had the courage or the ability or the resources to kill himself in another way.
I agree. I think it was a suicide, but I mean, a lot of suicides, it's like, how active were you? Because your brain isn't doing what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
Ever since I first learned about Poe back in the 7th grade, this has always been the theory that I've personally believed. Look at all the evidence. Look at how much he suffered and lost. Look at all the pain and sorrow he put into his writing, all his pleas for help that went unanswered and ignored. Look at his history of substance abuse. I find it hard to believe that he died any other way.
Of course, I, like everyone else, have no way to know for sure what ended Edgar Allan Poe's life. However, I think most people's reluctance to even acknowledge that suicide is a possible cause of death just plays into our culture's issue with refusing to even address the topic of mental illness. Nowadays, we have resources to help with mental health that Poe did not have access to: healthcare professionals and medicine. And while our healthcare is nowhere near where it should be, it's leagues ahead of that of the 19th century. But there are still many people today that do not view mental health as a real illness or something to be taken seriously. Whether or not Poe was mentally ill, and whether or not he did in fact commit suicide, I think the fact that so many fans of his work are unwilling to even discuss the possibility is doing a disservice to the difficult life he lived. Many mental health advocates today, myself included, have been criticized, being told that we should not put 21st century labels on 19th century life. But people have always been mentally ill. We didn't used to have words for the queer community, such as gay, lesbian, bisexual, but that doesn't mean that those kinds of people didn't always exist. Language is an ever-evolving tool to help us understand the world around us. Just because in the 19th century they didn't have the words to understand mental illness didn't mean that people weren't suffering from it.
Poe wrote much more than the few short stories and poems I've covered here today. Over the course of his lifetime, he wrote numerous short stories, poems, critical essays, reviews, even a full-length novel. He is considered one of the most successful writers in American history and is actually considered the first great American poet. The city of Baltimore capitalizes off his existence. There are Poe dolls, magnets, t-shirts, bumper stickers, candles. People get tattoos inspired by his short stories and poetry. There are bookstores across the nation selling multiple editions of his work. There are numerous books, movies, and comedy web series paying homage to the words he wrote. There is even a football team named after his most famous poem. But not only is Poe one of the most famous writers who ever lived, he's one of the most important. His words, to put it quite frankly, changed the world. However, I sadly don't think Poe, during his life, comprehended the impact his words had on the world and would continue to have for centuries to come.
Why do you think the works of Poe endure to this day?
I think it goes back to people secretly feel that way. I think it goes back to people want something to be able to relate to.
I think obviously there's something in his sadness that everybody can tap into, even if we are not all living quite so sad and horrible lives as he lived. But I think everybody has felt some amount of
despair.
He reinvented horror and helped to create new genres like mystery and detective fiction. He influenced a great many authors that came after him, from Arthur Conan Doyle to H.P. Lovecraft.
I think the way he writes allows you to tap into that like imagination where it's dark and creepy, but it starts like those wheels turning and you feel like you're a part of that world in a way that you're sometimes not in other writing.
He touches on something human, and he touches on something human that I don't think a lot of other people have done until recently. He talks a lot about death, he talks a lot about depression, he talks a lot about the inner feelings that we try to keep and hide inside.
I used to tell my students that classic literature isn't classic because it's old, it's classic because it's good. And you know, the Raven is good back in 1830 or 40 or 50, it's good in 2019. That, you know, just because it's old doesn't mean it's not still good.
I think when you're learning about him when you're a teenager, he has a lot of those kind of ideas that you have had, you felt, that you've never heard articulated.
But at the end of the day, the works endure primarily because they are just great works of literature.
Yeah, all the themes are very universal, as weird as he gets with it, which is what I like about it. Like, you can talk about guilt in a way that's like, I buried a body in my floor, and just like on a like structural level and everything, like his prose are so beautiful. Like, who can craft a like sentence that way?
Like, especially nowadays, there are so many people who suffer from mental illness that they read Edgar Allan Poe's work and they're like, wow, I'm not the only one, and oh my gosh, this has been around for so long.
It's just really important for us to just celebrate the fact that Poe is so relevant to popular culture. He is so loved. There are not that many authors that have that kind of recognition and power.
Poe's work endures to this day because he wrote into existence a pain, an agony, a loneliness that is so tragically universal. When I read Poe's work, when many, many other people around the world and all throughout time read his work, underneath the terror and the horror of his plots, Poe himself is there, holding out his hand to us, telling us not to be afraid, telling us that we are not alone.
Hearts in the Floor, The Raven.
That was a phase.
Rabies, brain tumor, flu, because the flu killed people. Author John...
Wait, rabies?
Yeah, I don't know where people... a raven gave him rabies, I guess.
I guess.
I love Edgar Allan Poe.